Welcome to Season 2 of Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. This is episode number 11, Murray Dickson Part C, The Martyrdom of Murray. Last week we heard about Murray's struggles to keep the American Institutes funded and open, and we heard about his struggle to explain to wealthy North Americans why foreign missions are important. We also learned how Murray was appointed to be district superintendent for all of Bolivia and how he changed his duties dramatically, causing him to travel all over Bolivia, and how it led him to becoming more and more committed to working for the indigenous, even to the point that he began to dress like the indigenous with his red poncho and big boots. This week we will hear about the continuing work to focus on evangelizing the indigenous, and you will hear brand new information that no one else knows but me. It is the circumstantial evidence that points to the very real possibility that Murray Dickson did not die from an accident on the world's most dangerous road, but was in fact martyred by the Bolivian government for educating the indigenous. In 1956, Bolivia was designated a land of decision by the Methodist Board of Missions. This was accomplished through the work of the Bishop of Bolivia, who was appointed by the Board of Missions, Bishop Sante Huberto Barberi from Brazil. This meant that over the next several years, there was a flood of new missionaries and new resources which poured into Bolivia. While some missionaries continued working in the cities, especially La Paz and Cochabamba, many of the missionaries were sent to remote locations to work with indigenous in such places as Ancarimas, Montero, Carabuco, Trinidad, Tio Rancho, and many other places. Murray's dreams were coming true, and his work changed as it became more and more administration and education of the new missionaries. With the new work and new resources, Murray's work schedule vastly accelerated. He was traveling all over Bolivia and frequently not home. The American Institute had a new missionary as director, which freed him up to do all of this work. He was even doing a lot of traveling outside of Bolivia to other South American churches and various regional conferences, and he was a valued speaker in the United States on Methodist missions work in general. Murray was invited by the government of Ecuador to join other Protestants in opening the door to Protestantism in that country. This, of course, led to more trips and more international meetings. At the 1960 Central Conference of the Methodist Church, which included Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay, Murray was prominent in the voting for the new bishop of this conference. Murray had not encouraged this talk and in fact spoke on behalf of B. Foster Stockwell, who was the head of the seminary in Buenos Aires, to become the bishop, and Stockwell won. But it was clear that Murray was in line to be the bishop of the Central Conference someday. Yet even in his many travels with his busy schedule, Murray always managed to have time to talk to people on the street and in the local churches. He would hear of their struggles and pains. Their struggles became his struggles. He would pray for them, and he would work to find a way to make things better for them. That was just the way he was. During his time, and profoundly encouraged and supported by Murray, Methodist schools popped up all over Bolivia. Some were derivatives of the American Institutes of La Paz and Cochabamba and taught the elite and the indigenous children in places like Trinidad, Cobija, Montero, and elsewhere. Others were much smaller schools in indigenous villages, teaching exclusively the children of indigenous campesinos in these villages. In 1953, there were the two American Institutes in La Paz and Cochabamba and 12 Methodist schools in the Campo, or the rural areas. The church also had the American Hospital in La Paz, which was established by Dr. Beck. The Frank Beck Hospital in Ancarimas was the only medical clinic in the Campo. Campo means rural areas. However, with all these missionaries, Methodist schools began to pop up all over the Campo. They taught the indigenous people how to read and write Spanish. They got them books to read to expand their world, and they preached about the love of God and how God don't make no trash, meaning that each person, whether Hispanic or indigenous, was a person of worth and deserved to be treated as equal. This was dangerous teaching. The Hispanic mestizo elite, while supporting quasi-democracy, still controlled all of the money and all of the power in the country. And they knew that education of the indigenous could be the thing that would bring an end to their cruel and unjust system. Pastor Gustavo Losa wrote in 1970, quote, "Education constituted the subversion instrument to stop the feudal system of the hacienda. But on the other hand, the indigenous communities realized the value of education also in the political field. That was the reason many indigenous leaders went to the city looking for support to create schools. They knew that education would open their eyes and would help them to find the light of truth." Gustavo continues, quote, "Both powers, religious and political, felt threatened because of the presence of the Methodist mission. The reason was because they were opening schools so indigenous could learn to read and recover their dignity and eventually question the hacienda system. On the other hand, the indigenous would learn a new manner to see, feel, and know God through the Gospels, and that would question the religious power of the Catholic priest. That is why the Methodist brothers were threatened so badly." End quote. Jim Palmer was one of those land of decision missionaries who came to Bolivia, and he immediately was impressed with Murray, and they became friends as well as colleagues. Jim tells how on December 16, 1961 was a normal day. Murray had received a message that the doctor working in Caranavi had become ill. Murray needed to go and check on him. Jim Palmer was supposed to drive him to Caranavi, but it was decided that Dr. Lou Tatum would take his Volkswagen and drive Murray to Caranavi. To get to Caranavi from La Paz, you must drive the, quote, "world's most dangerous road," unquote. Parentheses, look it up online. You will see some amazing videos on YouTube. I have ridden vehicles up and bicycles down the world's most dangerous road several times. I even drove a four-wheel drive vehicle up and down at one time to go to a church retreat. The road begins at La Cumbre at a pass of 14,783 feet in altitude and perpetually covered in snow. The road goes down one side of a giant ravine all the way to Caranavi, which is located on the road and is at 3,202 feet. That is over 2.2 miles in altitude lower. Caranavi is in the upper Amazon rainforest. This road was heavily traveled and was the primary road between the entire northeastern part of Bolivia and the capital until they completed a new, safer road which came down the opposite side of the ravine in the early 2000s. It is, at most places, an 8-foot wide dirt road with no guardrails. In many places, there are sheer drops of 700 feet or more off the side of the road. To add tremendously to the danger, traffic went both up and down it. When you are driving uphill and meet a car coming downhill, you have to back up until there is a place wide enough that the downhill driver can pass between you and the mountain wall while your car is precariously clinging to the road to avoid plunging to your death. However, no one was particularly worried about this drive since Murray and Dr. Tatum had driven the road many times. Later that day, Jim got a phone call from Nova, Murray's wife. "Jim, come please. There's been an accident." The car that either Murray or Dr. Tatum was driving had plunged off the road at kilometer marker 51 and finally stopped several hundred feet below, landing on the railroad right-of-way. The family had been told that Murray would be coming back to La Paz by train that night. The missionaries went into crisis mode. A doctor from the hospital and an ambulance drove up to La Cumbre at the top of the world's most dangerous road to interrupt the train and bring Murray down quicker in the ambulance to the hospital. However, when the train arrived, they found Murray's body, who apparently had died about an hour earlier. and Dr. Tatum's body would be coming on the next train. Over the next 3 months, Jim said he pieced together a story from the police and from a student of Murray's who said they had seen the accident. Apparently, a lumber truck was traveling up the road when they encountered Tatum's Volkswagen. As the lumber truck passed, it nudged the VW and down it went. Apparently, Dr. Tatum was killed instantly. Murray had been thrown out of the car or somehow managed to get free from the vehicle before it hit the tracks. Beaten, bleeding, and weak, he climbed partway back up the hill where a rope had been thrown down to him by people who stopped. As he was being pulled up, he was so weak he collapsed, lost control of the rope, and fell back down on the rock face of the mountain. Some men found a way down to the railroad tracks and hustled to where the men were. Murray was still alive, but in bad shape, and there was no medical help nearby. They stopped the next train going toward La Paz, loaded Murray on it, and they held Dr. Tatum's body to be put on the next train after that. Nova decided that Murray should be buried in his beloved Bolivia, and the British Embassy, who had a small cemetery in La Paz, agreed to allow him to be buried there. 3 months after the tragedy, Jim was stopped by a man on the street who told him that he owned a trucking firm, and he said that sometime after the disaster, one of his drivers was arrested and jailed for drunk driving, and using the typical methods of gaining a confession, meaning beating and tortures, the police had beaten the man until he was delirious. At one point, the truck owner was called to the jail, and his driver, while still at the police station, repeated a remorseful story about the horrible thing he had done at kilometer 51. But there was no way to prove this happened, and no further charges were ever brought against the man, which seems very odd. However, I heard a different story. I attended the centennial celebration of 100 years of evangelism and service by the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia in August of 2006. During the celebration, the executive committee, all the foreign dignitaries, a band, and others all went to visit Murray's grave to remember this great man of God who was so crucial to the movement to educate and bring the Aymaras to Methodism, and which led to the transformation of the IMB. As we were riding the bus to the gravesite, an Aymara pastor told me a different story, one believed by almost every Aymara Methodist whom I've spoken to about this event. He said that an Aymara Methodist was at La Cumbre and the beginning of the death road, and noticed that as the VW passed by with the 2 missionaries in it, there was a police vehicle traveling close behind. The Methodist Church of Bolivia was, and is, absolutely convinced that he was intentionally run off the road and killed, like so many others, by the military because of his advocacy for the rights and education of indigenous people. They believe that the driver who confessed only did so to end his torture. They feel that the fact that the driver had confessed to being drunk, had killed these 2 men, but was never faced trial of any type or any legal action was a sure sign that the police had tortured him and offered him a way out. Confess, and we won't charge you with murder. So the man, quote, confessed, unquote. When I pointed out that this was during a time of democracy with a president who was a graduate of the American Institute, the pastor felt it was even more of a sign that it was done by the military, because there were always tensions between the Criollo Mestizo elite who controlled the military and the democratically elected presidents. This would lead to yet another series of coups d'etats in 1964. I didn't put much stock on this story, as indigenous Methodists had suffered so much under the Criollo Mestizo-run military that they would automatically assume the military was behind Murray's death. However, in 2010, I became friends with a man named Mr. Bob Parker of Parker Drilling in Tulsa, Oklahoma. By the way, everyone called him Mr. Parker, and no one that I know called him Bob. Mr. Parker had become remarkably successful drilling oil wells all over the world. And later in life, he in fact ran the Department of Energy for the U.S. government under the Reagan administration. Mr. Parker was also Mr. Methodist and supported many Methodist projects. I had become familiar with him through my father, and in 1989, Mr. Parker helped my dad and I drill a water well for the people of Canani, Bolivia. In 2000, I was appointed to work full-time for Bolivia, developing the partnership between the U.S. Conference and the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia, and developing a nonprofit which worked in Bolivia called Engineers in Action. But I had zero salary support from anywhere, and I had to raise my own salary. Mr. Parker became my first and by far my largest supporter throughout this period of my life. Mr. Parker and I became friends and even occasionally ate dinner together. Mr. Parker began looking for oil in Bolivia in the 1950s and eventually drilled quite a few oil wells in the department of Santa Cruz, or the state of Santa Cruz. Mr. Parker knew Murray Dickson quite well and financially supported Murray in many of his projects and became a friend of Murray's from his frequent trips to Bolivia. And he told me a strange story that points to the idea that the indigenous Methodist understanding of what happened on that fateful drive is probably correct, and that the version given to Jim Palmer and the rest of the world was a cover-up by the military for the crime. Mr. Parker said that one day in 1961, Murray got an order to come in and talk to the Ministry of the Interior. The Ministry of the Interior, for those who don't know, is responsible for the security from threats inside the country. It would be something like the FBI, who looks for internal threats and people who might be doing local terrorism, etc. While technically under the control of the president, it was usually staffed by military personnel and was the place where many coups d'etats had originated. Consequently, knew that this was serious and a very scary appointment for Murray to go to. Why in the world does the Department of Interior want to speak to me? Murray wondered. It so happened Mr. Parker was in Bolivia at the time. Murray mentioned it to him. Now, Mr. Parker had built good relations with many members within the Bolivian government, and he recognized the seriousness of this meeting and quickly said, "Murray, I'll go with you. I want to hear what they have to say." When they arrived, the staff person allowed Mr. Parker to go into the office of the head of the Ministry of the Interior with Murray. Mr. Parker told me that the Interior Minister told Murray that if he and the Methodist Church did not stop teaching the indigenous how to read and write, something bad would happen to Murray. That's what Mr. Parker heard, and that's what he told me. Murray, being Murray, continued to educate the indigenous. And less than a year later, Murray was dead. Mr. Parker told me that he is absolutely convinced that Murray had been killed by the Department of the Interior, that they followed him up on the world's most dangerous road, and when they got to a dangerous point in the road, they simply pulled up behind him, nudged the car off the road and over the edge of the cliff. Mr. Parker continued by saying the Interior Ministry arrested a drunk driver to become the fall guy, tortured him, and got a false confession from him with a promise that they would stop torturing him and wouldn't put him in jail. Mr. Parker didn't tell very many people about this event that preceded Murray's death. Mr. Parker told me that there was no point in telling anyone. Justice would never come to those who planned this event. Again, remember, this was at a time, just because you had an elected president who was sympathetic to the Methodist Church doesn't mean that the military felt the same way. The military and the Ministry of the Interior were run entirely by Criollo and Mestizo officers who time and again led coups d'etats against the government and were completely aligned with the oligarchs and the wealthy elite of the country. And those oligarchs were willing to use the Ministry of Interior to do its dirty work to maintain that power. That's less true now, but that's just the way it was in the 1960s.
One bit of new information I just received comes from Paul McCleary's book, quote, Building for the New, unquote, which tells of his time in Bolivia and gives a missionary perspective of what happened in the IMB during the 1960s. Paul was in Bolivia when Murray was killed, and he tells of rushing over to the Dicksons' home only to find Nova, Murray's wife, standing in the front yard, which seemed odd to Paul. She said that they couldn't go into the house right then because, quote, two men from the embassy were going through Murray's study, unquote. Who were these guys? And what were they doing in Murray's office on the day of his death? Since Paul put this story in his book, I suspect that he still, to this day, has grave suspicions about the possible Bolivian government involvement. And many of the other missionaries had their suspicions too. But there was no proof of government involvement, and to challenge the government could easily have led to arrests and exiling of additional U.S. missionaries, putting themselves and their families at risk. All the Methodist missionaries and their families may have been in a very dangerous position at this time. In fact, some missionary children remember their dads and other church workers going into hiding for a period of time. And had the missionaries made a strong statement about a possible assassination, it might not just lead to the exile of missionary families, but could have led to additional threats, attacks, and missing persons among the Methodist laity. Consequently, Nova, despite her suspicions, made a public statement saying it was an accident. To say anything else could have put dozens of missionaries and IEMB Methodist lives at risk. This information simply accentuates the incredible faith and courage of Murray. Despite being warned by the Ministry of the Interior that something bad could happen to him if he didn't cease education and support of the indigenous, Murray carried on. We don't know for a fact that Murray and Dr. Tatum were assassinated, but if they were, they are the very definition of Christian martyrs, and they wouldn't be the last ones to do so. One of the most telling points that makes me believe the story of the assassination of Murray is the way in which Maggie Dickson, daughter of Murray and Nova Dickson, and what she told me as an immediate response to me telling her that I believed that he was assassinated.
To tag onto that, none of that surprises me.
Yeah, I didn't figure it would.
But to tag onto that, my dad, when he died, I found some letters that he kept copies of letters he sent everyone. And I had found letters that he had written to congressmen and senators right around the 52 revolution. And you have to remember that was also McCarthy era in this country.
Oh, that's right.
Okay. And so when the revolution came, there was great fear that this was another communist takeover. Okay. So the letters my dad had sent were pleading
I knew it.
that they would allow Bolivia to chart its own destiny, that they would not interfere. One of the things that happened, and it may have been that the military gave to the embassy, but the embassy returned my father's wedding ring and his passport. Yet they were not on him. They were returned by the embassy.
So when they found him on the train tracks, he was without his passport and his wedding ring.
Well, no, what happened was that there was a student on the truck that stopped, somebody who recognized it was my dad. And they rappelled down.
Right.
My dad, even though he could barely make sense, because I guess his head was broken, had insisted that they take Dr. Tatum up first. Then they brought him up. He tried to help him, but he wasn't, they weren't understanding whatever he was doing, but they could understand the emotions. And they brought him up, they laid him down, and that was the end. Yeah. So, but they didn't look for his wedding ring. They didn't look for whatever,
okay.
You know. But then a few days later, a day or two later, the embassy came with my dad's wedding ring and his passport. So we had those, and I think the passport went to Boston Avenue because it was one of those that had all these extensions, and I don't know what happened to it. It's probably in a box somewhere in the attic.
Yeah. I didn't hear that. it certainly seems possible that
well, it was
military somehow got made sure that he was dead.
Well, you have to remember that also it was around the time when Che Guevara was starting up his thing. And they were really, and the U.S. really had a deep vested interest in having a government that kowtowed. Yeah. Something that just came to my mind. Did you know that whole story about, I think his name was Flores, who was assassinated after my dad, probably 2 years later, 3 years later, for me. And he was like minister of something, or a diputado or something. And he was
a minister in the government.
In the government, yeah. And he was assassinated.
Yeah.
There, as he came out of the House of Government or something, I can't remember the details. But before he died, there were all these pamphlets that he was handing out that my father had written that was called Bolivian Defend Your Revolution. Wow. And I have a copy of it in Spanish.
Wow.
It's very interesting. You fought hard for this revolution. You fought hard for your voice. You need to defend it. And that probably did my dad in.
Yeah, that might have been what did your dad in. That might have been what did your dad.
Maggie told me that after her dad's death, Mr. Flores had printed additional copies of the pamphlet and was handing them out in the Methodist churches and just about anywhere they would accept them. Again, it was titled Bolivians Defend Your Revolution. The pamphlet, in both the original Spanish and an English translation, is located on weavingtheblanket.com. Look for the link to this episode on the webpage and then click on the Dig Deeper button, and you will find it there. Of course, none of this is direct evidence, just circumstantial, but it does establish that the government would have a clear motive for having Murray killed. It may be wrong, but the IMB, Mr. Robert Parker, and I believe the timing is more than a coincidence.
Let me insert a quick aside comment. During the first 300 years of the church, up to AD 310, a saint was not someone who was perfect or performed miracles. During those 300 years of oppression and execution of Christians by the Roman government, a saint was anyone who had been arrested or tortured for the faith. And those who were martyred were special saints who immediately went to heaven. It wasn't until Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire in 312 AD there were no more such martyrs within the Roman Empire. So gradually the church decided to make saints of those who performed miracles. Using that ancient definition of saint, I believe that it's fair to say that Murray Dickson, along with Dr. Tatum and all the indigenous Methodists who have been beaten, arrested, tortured, or even killed by the believing government or by local communities riled up by Catholic priests, all of those indigenous Methodists over the last 100 years are truly saints. Following his death, under the leadership of the civilian government of President Victor Paz Estensaro, the American Institute graduate, both houses of the government passed a resolution to give Murray posthumously the highest honor they could give him, a non-military Bolivian, the Order of the Condor of the Andes. As per Bolivian law, Murray was buried the following day, which was Sunday, December 17, 1961. Interestingly, during the regular worship service that morning before the funeral, Reverend Palmer and his congregation sang, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," the same hymn that Dr. Crespo will hear from his calculator as he's being tortured 20 years later. But that story will be coming in the next season. The funeral was held at La Forma, the largest Methodist church building in Bolivia, out of consideration for what and who Murray was, and for the presence of the great mixture of people, from powerful elites who attended from the American Institutes to the poorest of the poor indigenous people. The service was done in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Aymara. Following the service, they carried the casket from La Reforma up the Prado to the cemetery owned by the English embassy. As the cemetery workers lowered Murray's casket into the ground, there were quiet but frantic whispers among the workers. Try as they could not lower the casket into the grave. The grave had been dug too short. During 20 years of working with Bolivians and their human inadequacies and inconsistencies and poor planning, it was only fitting. Murray must have really laughed as he looked down on the scene. But it was also fitting. No grave could hold this man. Nova just laughed. She knew Murray would love it. Once again, I would like to encourage you to obtain a copy of Jim Palmer's book, Red Poncho, Big Boots, The Story of Murray Dickson. To do so, go to the website and make a $20 donation to the Bolivian Pastors Endowment Fund. Send me notification that you've made that donation, and I will send you the book. You'll enjoy reading it. See you next week.